All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about front-end development. Specifically, we're going to be starting off with something called vanilla development or vanilla JavaScript, right? Now, vanilla development is the concept of developing a front-end application with specifically just your static files, such as index.html, main.js, which is going to be your JavaScript file, and then main.css, which is going to be your styling file. And we're going to go into what each one of those are here shortly. Now, just to add into this lecture, I do want to go ahead and point out that we are going to be hosting our index.html utilizing the extension of Live Server. This is the extension that we'll be utilizing to actually host everything online or host everything inside of my designated browser. So if you're ever wondering while you're working through this material, hey, how is he actually rendering it? Or it's doing hot reload rather than having to click and drag the index.html file over and over to the browser, it's because we're hosting it utilizing Live Server. Now we have a list of elements that we have to work through today. And the first portion of our lecture is going to be a little bit dry. We're going to go over HTML document structure, some common elements such as header tags, division tags, and paragraph tags. We'll talk about list. We'll talk about text decorations. We'll dive into some self-closing tags, and we'll talk about forms. We'll then move on to talking about CSS, how to conduct CSS with inline styling, how to collect or connect our styling to an external style sheet. We'll go into selectors such as class, IDs, and the selector itself. And then finally, we'll go into the CSS box model. That is all for part one of our lecture. So there's quite a bit of content to go over, and we're going to squeeze it all within this next hour. All right. Does anyone have any questions over the material that we will be covering over part one? Perfect. Let's go and start talking about this. Well, what is index HTML, right? Why is this important? And here I have this box called client in the browser. So anytime an application renders for the very first time, and we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about a full stack application, the first request the browser ever sends out, and specifically for something that's client facing, right? The first request that the client ever sends out to the server will be a request for index.html. So a request comes out from client to server and says, hey, I need index.html. And then finally, the server responds to the client with the actual index.html file. Now, from there, a series of requests happen where the client notices, hey, index.html requires some styling. It requests the server for the styling and so on. But for now, we'll just worry about index.html. So the client makes the request, and after it makes the request, it comes back and it starts and it starts rendering. Hey, well, here we have the contents of index.html. Let's take a look at the Poke API real quick. If I go to the pokeapi.company and, oh, that is not what I meant to do. Let's go ahead and reset that real quick. All right. And I go to inspect it. Let's go over to the network tab, clear out, and let's refresh the page. All right, we come to the very top. We can see there's a request that went out to pokeapi.co, and that request responded with the RESTful API, Poke API, and try it now. And we can see a lot of information here. All of this information is actually index.html that we are seeing in this preview tab, right? It's not styled yet because it asks for style.css later on. And this is all of the styling that comes in and decorates this application to look the way it does. But it makes a request, and this is the first time that it responds. And it responds with index.html. Now, does that mean that every time the browser receives a request, it's always going to receive index.html? Well, the answer is no. For example, when I go to this endpoint here, I am responding with a JSON format. If I go to inspect and I come over to the network tab, I refresh, we can see a request was being sent out, and what I'm receiving back is JSON format. Well, the browser is able to render both, and the browser is not in control as to what it is that it's rendering, right? So depending on the endpoint is what gets sent to the server, and the server is what sends back the response. So rather than, hey, I need index HTML, it's more of, hey, currently at HTTP, I don't know, mysite.com with nothing following it. What do you want me to render? And from there, the server responds with index HTML. Now, how does the server know the difference, right? Other than just the file format, how does the server know to be able to render, hey, this is HTML, whereas this is just JSON request? Well, it starts off with the very headers. So let's go ahead and take a look here. All right, so I'm gonna come over to the request, not the request headers. Here we go, response. So if I could take a look at the response, we can see that I get a very first line there called doc type HTML. And the browser essentially grabs this tag and says, oh, okay, what I'm receiving is an HTML file. And everything that I should be reading moving forward should be rendered exactly as HTML. All right. So that goes a little bit into the importance of document object structure or how you structure your HTML document. Because when we first open up an HTML document, it always starts off as an empty header. All right. Does anyone have any questions about what I just broke down? Fantastic. So starts off empty. What's the easiest way to start generating all this information? Most VS codes nowadays, if you have the latest version, it comes with a built-in shortcut here. You could put exclamation point and then press tab. And as you press tab, it's going to give you all of the necessary headers to set up your HTML document. So again, it's exclamation point and then tab inside of an HTML document. Now, this is going to give us the same structure that we just saw. It gives us, hey, this is index HTML that way you're going to be reading, and it gives me a header called HTML. Now, notice how this tag is replicated down below, right? We're seeing it twice. We see it at the start and at the end, meaning that head and body are children of HTML, right? So there's HTML, and then this thing has its children's. It has head and it has body inside of it, right? Everything is nested. You could think of it how in JavaScript we have the curly brackets to nest specific bodies of if statements in for loops. Well, in HTML, we physically wrap them by putting the closing and the opening tag around what it is that we want to be nested. All right. So this HTML language EN, that's just clarifying the language that everything's going to be written in. And it helps the browser be able to realize what kind of information to render, right? So if I'm writing in English, let's say I have something, some sort of reader that's working with my application, to make it accessible for people who can't necessarily see, or let's say I have some other forms of text documentation where people can actually write text. By setting this language, it helps the browser talk to all those different tools and setting a common language all across. All right. Now, if I come over to this tab and I refresh it, it now says document. Well, before, when I didn't have this, it just gave me my actual router or my browser number. All right. But the moment that I bring in this exclamation tag, it updates and it states that it's called document. Now, this document on this tab is related to the document on this title. Right? That's what sets the tab there. Everything within this header tag is information that the browser is going to read prior to rendering any of the body. And it helps the browser just set up. um, all of the information, such as the character set, right? We're choosing to utilize UTF-8. And then this has to do with styling. So in dimensions of the browser, we want there to be a 1-to-1 ratio. And we are seeing that 1-to-1 ratio here. When it goes initial scale 1.0. So that's just saying, depending on, rather than going by pixels on the screen or rather than going by, um, because obviously it would render less pixels if I scroll it down or if I stand it up. If I'm on different monitors, it's going to go by the actual width of the browser and do the math for me to do all the percentages so that my padding, let's say I say padding is 1 pixel, it would be 1 pixel in reference to the current browser or the current screen that I'm utilizing right now, right? And that's why it goes into device width and initial scale. All right. So again, the header tag is more like a prep. So first, we tell the browser, hey, you're going to be reading HTML. Before you start reading any of the HTML documentation, you should probably prep yourself. And here's all the preparation steps that you need in order to be able to read this HTML properly. And then finally, it goes into the body. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the HTML document structure? Okay, great. Now that we've actually seen some HTML document structure, we can start breaking down the body. And we're going to start off talking about some common elements such as H1s, divs, and p tags. And let me put this to sleep. There you go. All right, so H1 for headers, divs, and paragraph tags. Now, a header or an H1 is unique in the essence that it tells you what is the title or the header of the entire document, right? So here we can say Corsair vanilla development. And then that would render on the screen saying Corsair vanilla development. Now, after that, you can break it down into sections. For example, we know that in the very first part of our lecture, we're going to be talking about the HTML document, and we will also be talking about CSS, right? And we could even call this, break this down to say, hey, this is part one. State this as part three, and then do HTML. H3 for CSS. And we can dive further in there. We could go H2 back again and do HTML. And notice how I'm utilizing capitalization on the second HTML. That really changes nothing as far as HTML selectors go. As long as they follow the correct spelling convention, HTML doesn't care if it's capitalized or not, right? It's not going to throw any sort of error for that. It's not as angry as some of our other languages, right? So we can dive into this. This will be in part two. We'll be talking about the JS DOM, right? And so on. Now you can see how this is helpful in breaking down hierarchy, right? As a reader, I want to know what's most important to me and all of the subheaders. And that's usually where or header elements come into place, right? As the numbers go up, the size of the header goes down. So think about it in priority, not sizes. All right. So H1 is my number one priority. H2 is my number two priority, and so on. So it's in priority status. All right. And it goes all the way down into H6 of this is a where header six is actually pretty hard to be able to see. All right. So now those are our header tabs. Header tabs are fantastic. But something that we commonly utilize to group things are div tags. Now you'll notice that the div isn't visual. You can't see the div. right? If I go and start adding some more information, for example, let's say I add our P tag, which we were talking about, and I put some lorem ipsum in there. Now, the lorem ipsum inside of the paragraph tag renders correctly, and lorem ipsum is just random text. It's nothing crazy. Um, so now I have all this random text that's currently being rendered, but the div tag is nowhere to be visible. So what use does a division tag have for me? Can anybody think of some examples?
Does it come into play when you use CSS?
It comes into play when I utilize CSS. Yes, absolutely. And then it can also come into play in the fact that I could divide specific content. For example, if I come over to the Poke API, in the Poke API here, I have multiple different pieces of content. For example, I have my navigation tab that I want to keep track of. I have this nice banner that's also currently being rendered, right? Then I have this, which I don't even know what I would call it. Then we go into a form that's receiving some acceptance. But each one of these are components that would want to be divided by their own division. So whenever you want to divide a group of content and keep it grouped, you utilize the division tag. All right. And then we have our paragraph tag, which as we all saw is utilized to interpret text. So there's all of our text from our paragraph tag. Instead of calling this document, we'll call it Corsair. There you go. All right. So there's some of our very common tags there. Let's dive into our next portion now. We're going to be talking about list, unordered, and ordered. And I'm going to keep it up top just because our document is going to get pretty large. So I'm just going to put list. So now in HTML, there's two type of lists by default. There's ordered list and unordered list. Unordered lists are explained by UL. That stands for unordered. And let me move that up. Each one, so keep that there. Now, although there's two different types of list, all of them take in list items. So for example, this list item may be, I don't know, look up, code, eat, out, and we'll see. All right, this is a good way to be able to track of a list or be able to write a list. You could have different items. And notice that because it's unordered, we have these bullet points. Now, the only difference between an unordered list and a ordered list, there you go, is they're decorators for signifying information, right? Where an unordered list utilizes disk or bullet points, and an ordered list goes down in numerical order. All right. Does anyone have any questions over any of the material that we covered up to this point? Perfect. Let's keep going. All right, next we have a couple of text decorators. For example, we have strong, emphasize, and span. And I'm just going to go ahead and add these here. So let's do some text decorators. If you ever want to make something bold, you'll do that with strong. Right? You can see that this wake up at the very top here has now turned bold in comparison to this wake up down below. And the really cool thing about the strong tag is that since it's independent, you could apply it to only one piece of text. Let's say that the only thing I wanted to be bold is the W. I could write it as such, and only the W would be bold. I mean bold, while the rest of them are still spelled in the same exact format. Right? We have our emphasize. You can just write EM for code, and you can see that that italicizes whatever we want to emphasize. And then we have the span tag. Now, the span tag doesn't really provide any sort of decoration on its own, but it does give us the ability to isolate one independent letter at a time. And the virtues behind that really don't demonstrate until we start implementing CSS. For example, a very common use for a span tag, if you have a text that you would like to curve like a rainbow, right, and maybe spell out span, each one of these, what they actually have in CSS styling, they have a point of reference that they use as a radius, and then they rotate depending on their order, right? So it would be something like, hey, span of one, rotate negative something degrees. Let's just go ahead and say it's 30 degrees that it's rotating. Span two, I want you to rotate 15 degrees or negative 15 degrees. Span so on would be zero, and then finally n would be 15 degrees. And that's what creates this arch, right? But in order to be able to implement this arch, each one of them have to be their independent element. And that's what a good use of span there. All right. Next, we're going to go to self-closing tags. Now, self-closing tags are extremely useful and actually very common to find. For example, we see this lorem ipsum. There's a clear break in between these two iterations of lorem ipsum. And here's the next place where the lorem ipsum starts. So here's our first text of lorem ipsum, and here's the second iteration. But I have an indentation, and it's not being reflected. If I do a bunch of enters, it's still not shown. And as a matter of fact, if I do this into my list items as well, it's also not shown. Well, that's because HTML itself doesn't care about white spaces, right? You could write as much white space as you want, but unless it's inside of an HTML tag, such as list item or paragraph tag, it doesn't depict it. But notice this is inside the paragraph tag. It shows the spaces in between words, but it doesn't show multiple spaces, right? The space between this L and the period of venium is interpreted as a one. So what if I actually wanted multiple line breaks or an actual space in between those? Well, this is where a break tag would come into play. And by placing in a break tag, I am starting a new line, right? Now notice this is also self-closing. It doesn't take in any information, nor does it group any information. So because it doesn't group anything, it closes automatically. Right? If we wanted multiple break tags or a space in between the lines, you would have to have two break tags. One to end the text and the other to consume an entire other line. All right. Now, other types of tags that are self-closing, there's going to be the input and image. We'll cover image first, and then we'll dive into input. Image. So the image tag takes in an argument called source. And this is also a self-closing tag because it's not meant to actually group anything up. Let's go ahead and copy the image address for this. And I'm going to paste it here. If I come back over to Corsair, I can now see the Pokey API image. That is coming from this image tag. All right, so the image tag is a self-closing tag that receives one attribute. This is called an attribute of source. That attribute of source receives a string, which is a URL pattern for the image that I want to render. All right, and now we go into input forms. Now, input is a very special type of element because you're going to be utilizing it a lot inside of your forms. And there's a plethora of different ways that you can utilize it. For example, there's input type text. And for simplicity's sake, let's go ahead and put this all inside of a UL. All right, so there's our input type text. We could also have, and I should probably do this way. That way we can see it. We can also have something like date, and that will actually collect a date. We could collect something like color. There's file. Let's see. Text, month, color, file. And then there's password, which password is pretty useful. All right. So there's plenty of other ways that you can actually manipulate all of these different list items. We're not going to go over every single one of them, but as you can see here, I could actually type into this input field. I can set a date and a calendar pops up automatically for me that I would like to choose. I could choose a color. I can come over to a file and choose a file from within my documents. And if I go to type in a password, it's still reading the text. It's just blind typing, right? It's showing dots rather than actually reading the password here. All right. Now, other really useful things are going to be, all right, I'm not trying to save the password. Thank you. There is, oh, hello, radio, where radio you can check. And there is, I believe it's called checkbox, where checkbox can be checked and unchecked, right? So all of those different things are available for you to utilize as input fields. Let me actually put a header here. Let's do something like an H3. All right. So now we've covered images, we've covered input fields, we've covered unordered list and order list, some common HTML types such as div, paragraphs, and line breaks for self-closing tags. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the HTML elements that we've covered?
I have a couple.
Yeah, let's
Uh,
hear it.
For input ones, just like in some of the other languages, when you're able to do defaults, are you able to do defaults for input stuff? I don't know if you would want to, but
Yeah, you absolutely can. What you're talking about is called a placeholder. So for example, this text, you do something like placeholder, type in your name. Um, for here, you could do a placeholder and you would actually have to provide a date. So let's do 12/11/1987. And now when you click it, oh, that didn't work. I know you can provide one for date. I just don't know how to off the top of my head.
Okay, but
S-
yeah, so it's just like right there. So basically, it's like a similar functionality. And then when it comes to the div and break, obviously, like break is self-closing, but they're almost similar in a respect. Like you could divide things more and not use breaks, I suppose. Um, but then what, how does it know for words to only do, is it like if you do two spaces per between words, it won't do it? So basically, just any word with a maximum of one space, it'll treat as words. Like, how does it know that the words are words? I know that's like a really weird saying, but
got it. So to simplify that, HTML treats blank spaces as one. So I could have as much blank spaces as I would like.
okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it just basically treats everything like one space. So that, okay,
Yeah. And I would group all of this to a singular space,
okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
of course. All right. Any other questions?
The attributes that you were putting in for input, I saw some of them were capitalized and some of them were lowercase. Does that matter?
Let me go ahead and go back to that here. I apologize. Attributes that I put in. Oh, I see. Like the actual values.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's going to read it normally.
Okay.
Preferably you want to do lowercase. It's just that I was control Ding, so I was moving to both of those locations. But ideally, all of these should be lowercase by standard convention. Does that answer your
Got it.
question?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Anything else? Okay, great. Now let's go into forms. Now, we're leaving forms for last because forms are actually going to be something that we talk about extensively, especially with JavaScript. So we actually, before we go into forms, let's talk about some more of the HTML document structure, right? Ah, and this is called HTML semantics. Now, HTML semantics is important in the essence that it helps group information and it helps other developers be able to find information pretty well. For example, as we broke down the Poke API before, we have a navigation bar, we have a footer, and we have a body, right? Well, those three things are broken down into main, content, and let's see here. Yeah, so we have header, main, and footer. I apologize. Right. So it would break down as such, where we have a header. And in a header, I would want something like my image and my H1 tag, right? Then after that, I should have something like not a body, but instead main. This is where all of the main content that I've written would go. So I would highlight this entire division here and move it up into main. All right, now you can see main is wrapping all that information. And then finally, we have the footer, where for the footer, we could just put this is a footer. Now, it doesn't change anything, right? Like visually, it's not changing any sort of aspect as to my HTML document. But the use behind these things is specifically for other developers and for isolation of responsibilities, right? It's not going to change anything in the browser, but for example, let's talk about if this HTML document was hundreds of lines of code and something broke down near the footer. Well, I would want to be able to easily identify, okay, out of these 100 lines, I know that these 30 are the ones that are designated for the footer. So I could just go into this 30 lines and try to figure out where that error is coming from. All right. Same thing with your main content. Inside of your main content, there's other ways that you could break information. For example, you could throw in something called a section. And for this section, you could even add something like, hey, this section is specifically covering input fields. All right, I can go over all of the input field information and move it up into my section. And then I have my text decorations along with list. All right, I can create this into a different section. And come down and grab all of my list. Bring it up. Now that's all nested within its own section. All right, I could separate it by white spaces if I wanted to. You can see how the use case becomes just being able to easily read information. For example, when I go look for something now, let's say I'm looking for the section that's covering unordered list. All right. Well, I start off by reading the very left side. Okay, well, here's my body. That's what I want to look into. I don't want to look into headers, but I do want to look into main. As I'm looking into main, I want to find the section that says unordered list. Oh, that's not the right section. Here it is. Here's the section that describes list and decorators. And now I easily found the section that I want to work and write some code into. All right, so this is strictly just semantics to help other developers be able to quickly find code and change or update information. All right. Now there are other things you could set asides, articles, or even nav. Those are other types of semantics that can be involved, but we're not going to cover them here in this class. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding HTML semantics? Okay. Next thing we're going to be talking about is going to be a form. Now, forms are something that we're going to be utilizing in this program quite often, and you're going to be utilizing it to capture user input. Now, a form is unique in the fact that it captures user input. So let's give this a name and say username. Let's give it a type of text. We're going to close it. We're going to create an input, give this a name, call it favorite color, and give it a type of color. And then finally, we'll go ahead and create an input field, type submit. And I'll go ahead and call this, I don't know, let's go ahead and give it a header, user data. So there's my form, rendering nice and neat on my screen. I can go ahead and put that my name is Francisco. I'm gonna put in a color. And the neat thing about forms is that I can either click a button to submit my form, or I can press enter to submit my form. Now, in this case, I'm going to click submit this button, but I want you all to pay attention or pay special attention to how my URL is going to change the moment that I submit this form. So we're going to go ahead and click it. I click on submit. And now, if you take a look at my URL has captured, although my user field is now empty and my color was reset to its default value, my username was captured. All right, so there's Francisco that has been captured. And my favorite color has also been captured and stored into the URL parameters. All right, so I'm capturing user data and I'm sending it through URL parameters. Pretty similar to how the Poke API works, right? Where the Poke API, I'm sending ditto and it's rendering information. Well, if I change this from Ditto to Pikachu, and I probably didn't spell Pikachu right. No, I definitely spelled it right. Let's try a different one. Let's go with Bulbasaur. There you go. Yeah, I didn't spell Pikachu right. That's interesting. All right, so we go and see Bulbasaur. All the information for Bulbasaur comes back. We are capturing the user input and using it to be able to interpret data. And we're going to see that later on once we start implementing some JavaScript into our document. All right. Forms are particularly useful for capturing data and sending data through URL parameters or into JavaScript. I could just put a bunch of input fields and then capture each independent input field, but it's a lot easier if everything is wrapped inside of a form and we just grab the data itself strictly from the form. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding forms? Great. Doesn't seem like we have any questions. So let's start talking about some CSS here. And let's start off with the body tag specifically, because as of now, we have a paragraph tag with some information in there. And actually, I can break this up and let's go ahead and close this paragraph tag and let's open up a new one. All right, so now I have two paragraph tags. They're still rendering exactly the same. Nothing really changed. I could move this break to the outside, and none of the behavior of my application has really changed as of now. Okay, well, what use is this div tag? Well, we talked that the div divides and groups specific parts of your HTML. This becomes specifically useful when we conduct something called styling. Now, this is diving into CSS. The concept of styling, which stands or CSS stands for cascading style sheets, is that it should render styles in a cascading format. And we're going to see that here later on once we start working into our document. Let's make this kind of simple. All right, let's go ahead and add a border. We're going to make it 1 pixel solid, and let's make it black. Well, now my entire division tag has become visible. I could change things about my division tag. I could change the max width to be 50% of my content. And now notice how my division tag has shortened up and it only utilizes 50% of the width of my screen. All right, as I make it larger and I make it smaller, it stays stuck to 50% of my screen. I could even add a background color, stating that my background color should be something like sky blue. And now that specific division shares all of the background color of sky blue. And finally, I can add something like text color or just color, which is what actually alters text. And I could say that the color, I want it to be red. And there it is. Well, it's cascading. So if I go to my paragraph tag and add some styling here, and for my paragraph tag, I say that the background color shall be gold or goldenrod, and that I want my text, because let's say I didn't like my text, I want it to be black. Well, now only that specific block, this one paragraph tag, holds this styling. It's cascading in the essence that at the start of my division tag, the blue is seen at the very start. But because the next set of styling that comes in is changing it to goldenrod and text black, it overrides the parent, right? So this is the case where the child has greater power than the parent. All right. Now, style tags are great for being able to write information. But the problem with style tags is that you generally don't want to put too much behavior inside of one specific file, right? Just like in OOP where we applied the single responsibility principle, we're going to apply that same exact principle to everything in web development. So for example, index HTML should be in charge of rendering HTML. But what about styling? Well, I can do something like this. All right, let's say I take off my inline style tags because this is styling that's happening inline. And I come to the very top of my header. I could add something called style. And in this style, I can write CSS. Now, CSS is written as such. You start off by specifying what selector it is you want this styling to be applied to. You open up some curly brackets, and inside of those curly brackets, you specify what is going into that division. So for example, I want to change the background color to sky blue. I want the width to be 50%. And I want the text color to be brown. Right? And there's my nice division now. I could even change it to something like 75%. And there it is. Right? Now I can write all of my CSS within these style tags. So there's a little bit more isolation there, right? But still, I'm still writing CSS inside of index HTML. What if I have a tremendous amount of CSS? If we take a look at the Poke API, as we saw earlier, when we scrolled up to the top, oh, let me go ahead and refresh this. We took a look at their styles, and this is a pretty good amount of styling that was written. Right? Not only that, but this isn't the only styles there is. There's other styles that were written and that are being applied to this application. Well, you want to keep your file somewhat small so that you can find bugs or you can change information, update information. The maintenance of your application is heavily going to depend on how small you can keep your files and how isolated you can keep each behavior. This is where assets comes into play. We have this main.css that sets the entire background of the body to aqua. As of now, it's not connected. We know it's not connected because the background on my body is very much white. Well, how do I go into connecting these? I can connect these two by utilizing something called the link tag. I can specify I want to utilize the link tag with a relationship style sheet. You can see that this link tag doesn't close, right? Neither did any of the meta tags. That's okay. It kind of breaks the normal convention of most HTML tags. And then it has href. In this href, you just want to specify how is it that it can find this style sheet. So for example, within this directory, I have a directory named assets that holds main.css. And now my background color for my entire body is aqua. All right. Well, let's inspect this browser now. And let's take a look at the network tab. If I refresh my site, there's a couple of requests that are already going out. The very first one is for index.html. And this is actually going to hold all of my index.html that I have. We then have the Poke API, which I take a look at the preview. There's my Poke API. All right, it's going from top to bottom. It sees that it's going to need this image. And then finally, it makes a separate request for main.css. And this is where my CSS file comes in. So as of now, my web browser says, hey, I'm currently at the following address. What do you want me to render? I want you to render index.html. And then after that, it says, and let me move this browser portion a little bit here. There you go. After that, my browser asks for styling. It says, why are you not? There you go. It goes index is asking for main.css. And then our server is able to respond back to the browser with here's main.css. Right, so it's a conversation that's going back and forth between our server and the browser. All right. Now you may ask yourself, currently right now, I'm applying all of my styling specifically to selectors, but that raises somewhat of an issue. For example, let's say that I want to apply something like this, right? I want list items to have a text decoration of underline. Well, now every single list item in my document has this text decoration of underline. And maybe that's not what I want. Maybe there's only a group of items that I want to have that text decoration. Well, I could come over to index.html, and this is where classes and IDs come into play. For example, let's say I grab all of my list items. And for every single one of my list items, I am going to give them an attribute named class. And this class is going to be input li. Well, now instead of giving this CSS styling to list items, I could give this CSS styling to the class. This dot signifies that I'm about to write a class of input li. And now we can see on the right-hand side of my screen, only my input list items hold the text decoration of underline. Right, so again, we're trying to isolate and group specific behavior. Right, rather than repeat myself and give this exact same styling to every single one of them, I can group them by giving them all a class and then defining the styling for a class one time. All right. Now, that's for multiple items. What if there was a singular item? All right. Let's talk about something like, again, we have all these list items that we're working with, right? And actually we have two unordered lists. So let's talk about these unordered lists. Maybe I want my input fields unordered list to show up as such. So I can go into UElse, say, hey, I wanted to have a background color of goldenrod. Well, now both of my unordered list items are being applied. Now we talked about classes, and classes are for multiple items, right? Well, in this case, I want a singular unordered list to have the styling. We can apply styling to singular forms by adding an ID. So I can say ID and say input list, or I can call it input UL. Now, when I write this down in CSS, I would do so by adding a pound sign. That pound sign means I'm about to write an ID. And in this case, input UL is the ID that I'm looking for. All right, so we have the ability to select information in three separate ways. I can select them by class, which will be multiple items. I can select them by ID, which should be a unique item, or I can select them by selector. And selector is just paragraph tag, div tag, list item, so on. We saw a couple of them. Well, let's talk about the hierarchy of every single one of them. Let's say that I go in here and for some inline styling, add style. And I say the background color should be aqua. Well, now it's rendering as aqua. Why is that happening? Why is it rendering as aqua and not as goldenrod?
I mean, like a similar child-parent thing where the child is just better than parent.
Nice. Yeah. So in this case, it's because the last thing to render onto the screen is my HTML, right? So if we're thinking about the browser is going through the HTML document from top to bottom. The browser says, oh, okay, I need to load all the CSS styling. Cool. Let me load all the CSS. At this point here, or point one, the unordered list is aqua. Or excuse me, it's not aqua. It's goldenrod, right? So let's do GR. And then it starts scrolling down. And it starts rendering. Well, then it gets here. And it says, all right, unordered list of input UL. Well, you're supposed to be goldenrod. But then I tell it, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Inline styling says that this unordered list should be aqua. And it changes it back to aqua, right? Because this is the last command that the browser is reading. Now let's talk about hierarchy of things. Right? This is CSS or cascading style sheets, meaning that the last command to come in is going to be first. Well, if that's the case, I'm gonna give this input items here, or these this input li. Let me give them some background color. And this background color, let's call it blue violet. Now you can see this blue violet being activated for every single one of them. All right. And let's grab this input li and give it an ID. Now this ID for this input li is going to be text input. Well, we have a text input. And I'm going to give it a background color of, let's go back to goldenrod. Now let's take a look at this. If we're going from order top to bottom, it makes sense that this text input is goldenrod. Right? And specifically, we're manipulating this text input here. Well, let's see what happens when I switch up the order. I'm going to go ahead and take that out. And then bring in text input. My text input is still goldenrod. But my class, which comes afterwards, is telling it to be blue violet. So why? If this is second, the browser is reading this next. Why is it still holding on to this goldenrod value?
It's because the priority is based on the index file HTML versus the CSS file.
Okay, let's try that out. All right. That is a very good theory. So let's go ahead and put it into practice. Let's change the order here. All right, I'm gonna change this class input to left-hand side. And it's still doing the same thing. Well, in this case, this is because IDs take priority over classes. And then classes take priority over selectors. For example, if I go into the same exact list items and say I want all my list items to have a background color of, I'm running out of background colors here. Let's go ahead and go with yellow. You can see all of these list items down here are yellow. All right. And let me take that one out so we can see it. We can see all these list items down here are yellow. That's because this selector states all list items will be yellow. So here we have list items. That's the selector that I've created. Then we see that all of these list items are actually violet. That is because of my class indicator. So classes will overpower list items. And then finally, we see this singular input field here is still goldenrod. That is because IDs will overpower classes and list items. All right, so we're still following cascading style sheets, but we also have a hierarchy order where IDs are greater than classes and list items, and classes are greater than list items, or the selector itself. Does anyone have any questions about classes, IDs, and selectors?
So can IDs be like anything? Like everything else seems like very specific. But are the IDs whatever you make it up to be?
Yes. Both
Okay.
the class names and ID names are variables, so you can make them
Okay.
whatever you want. All right. Okay. So now the last thing that we're going to talk about for this part one of our lecture is going to be the CSS box model. And to demonstrate the CSS box model, I'm actually going to do a division that holds a division. I'm going to give this the ID of container, and I'm going to give this the ID of child. All right, let's go into these two. That is not big enough. Much better. All right. And please don't worry about the following portion that I'm about to add here. All right. So here's my CSS box model. And if I inspect this, what we're referencing by the CSS box model is not the actual box that I just drew, but rather this nice handy dandy box that's being provided to us on the lower right hand side. Now, this is very useful for styling. You can click on the selector tool and hover over different portions of your HTML document and select a specific input field to be able to take a look at the CSS inside of it. Now here we can see that for the div of container. I currently have a border that occupies 3 pixels with zero padding and content of 150 pixels. Now there's also this margin and this padding on the inside. Now border is pretty obvious. We can see that we have this black line. That's currently our border, and that's 3 pixels, right? But what is all this padding and this margin that we're talking about? Let's go ahead and add some margin. Let's go ahead and do 15 pixels is in reference to everything outside of your border. So currently, as I'm hovering over it, if we pay attention to this area of my screen, if I hover over margin, you can see that that gold gets highlighted on the outside of my border. That is the margin of 15 pixels, right? And it pushes all other elements away by 15 pixels. All right, you can see where the header starts of user data is right after those 15 pixels, and the image right above it is right after the 15 pixels above. Then we have our border, which is 3 pixels, and then we start talking about padding. Well, inside of padding, I have a content of 150 pixels. Let's add some padding now. Let's do padding, and let's do 20 pixels. All right. You'll notice that our box got a little bigger than what it used to be. Now, why is that? When I gave it a height and width of 150 pixels, why would it change its complete amount of size? Well, it's because not only did we tell it the content should be 150 pixels, we also told it that the space between our content and the border should be 20 pixels in between. So now everything inside of our border is 170 pixels, or excuse me, 190, because it's 20 to the left and 20 to the right, or left and right. There you go. So again, we have our original 150. We added 20 pixels of padding to all of our sides, top, bottom, left, and right. We then have our border of 3 pixels, and then we have our margin of 15 pixels on the outside. Padding is space from border to content. It's inside the border. Margin is space from border to the outside, and it spaces out, pushes away other elements. Does anyone have any questions over how to read or interpret the values of the CSS box model down below? All right. It doesn't seem like we have any questions. I know that this was more of a death by PowerPoint than anything, so I do apologize for the structure of the lesson, but there's no other way to really deliver this, right? So we covered what is HTML, the HTML document structure, common elements that are listed in it, such as H1 through H6, the division tag, the paragraph tag. We covered lists, text decoration, self-closing tags, forms. We then grabbed CSS, where we talked about inline styling, different types of style tags, plugging in an external style sheet. And then we talked about different types of CSS selectors, such as classes, IDs, and then the selector hierarchy, where ID is greater than classes and selectors, classes is only greater than selectors. Finally, we just finished talking about the CSS box model, where we have our content, padding, border, and margin. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the material that we covered in part one?
I do, as far as like broadly for HTML.
Yeah,
So
let's hear
like
it.
for me, I use obviously what we've learned so far is context being Python and JavaScript. You're doing this as you go, but is there like an equivalent for, because like the live server, but is there equivalent for um, a virtual environment or like NPM for HTML, since you might not want to have the go like as you go. Does that make sense?
I think it does. And to answer your question in short, there's not really an equivalent. HTML is just a type of document that can be hosted by different platforms, right? So, for example, HTML is specifically for the browser to be able to render content to the user. There's no framework that's compiling HTML for you. Does that
Gotcha. And
answer your
then,
question?
yeah, because then, I mean, if we didn't turn live server on, you could make the HTML file in VS Code, and it just wouldn't upload,
So
basically.
you could do it without live server. You could just click and drag it,
Oh, gotcha.
and then it
Okay.
would try to render it.
That makes sense. All right, cool. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. It doesn't seem like we have any other questions. I'm gonna go ahead and stop our recording here. As soon as I find my Zoom bar, there you are.